Okay, today's stuff that we're learning is Eruvin Sadi Dalid. Today's shiur is dedicated by Tzipi Wokenfeld for Refuah Shlema for Yakira Liba Bat Saragita, our sweet, brave girl. Share Refuah Shlema. Okay, we're starting at the bottom of Tzadi Gimel Amud Bet with something we started discussing yesterday. Itmar. Kotel Sheben Shtei Chatzerot. Shenafal. If you have a wall that falls, that's in between two courtyards, and it falls down on Shabbat, what happens at that point? At that point, we no longer have a wall between us. If I, let's say, made an Eruv with my courtyard and you made an Eruv with your courtyard, but we didn't make an Eruv together, and now all of a sudden it's open and there's free range between me and you, our courtyard and your courtyard. So what's the issue? The issue is, well, when Shabbat started, it was all okay, and we each had our own separate space. Now that the wall fell, we're now forbidden, and if the wall had fallen before Shabbat, for sure we wouldn't have been allowed to carry unless we all did one Eruv together. So what's the halacha? Rav Amar, this space is viewed as a public space now, and it's not fully public, but you and I both have rights to walk there, and we didn't make an Eruv, so no one's allowed to carry. And therefore, all you have is 4 cubits, like as if you're in the public domain. Ushmuel Amar, according to Shmuel, since when Shabbat started, we were allowed to carry, therefore we can continue to carry in this space. Everyone can carry up until where the mechitza used to be. So I can carry within my courtyard until where the mechitza was, and you can carry in your courtyard until where the mechitza was. Now they say, but you should just know that Rav didn't say this explicitly, and this happens very often where the Gemara says, "V'ha Rav lav beferush itmar." He didn't actually say explicitly, "This is my opinion," but ela michlala itmar. But we inferred it from a particular situation that happened. Now, before we tell the story, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Rav and Shmuel. Shmuel lived in Bavel, in Babylonia. He went to Eretz Israel for a little while to learn, came back to Babylonia before Shmuel went to Babylonia. If you remember, there's that. We always refer to it, Ki ata Rav leBavel. When Rav got to Bavel, people say it's around 219. The year he came to Bavel, that was this big moment because Rav was this huge Talmid Chacham and he set up a yeshiva there. But it's not exactly clear that he didn't set up a yeshiva right away. And we're going to see he got to Nahardea, which was where Shmuel was. And they wanted him to be the Rosh Yeshiva. And he said no, because he said Shmuel is the Rosh Yeshiva here. And I don't want to, or he's the biggest gadol here. I don't want to step on his toes. It's not appropriate. So ultimately, Rav moves to Surah and he sets up his own yeshiva there. So I wanted to mention this story because it's interesting to see Rav's, right? It wasn't like, oh, it's true, I'm a more important rabbi, I'll take the job. He was sensitive to Shmuel, and we're going to see the same thing in this story. He was sensitive, but to a point. And that's exactly what we're going to see in the story. Shmuel, so Rav and Shmuel, the Rav and Shmuel have a yatve ba'u chatzer. They were sitting together in a courtyard. Nafal guda de bene bene. All of a sudden, in the middle of Shabbat, the wall between their two courtyards falls. Amar lehu Shmuel, Shmuel said to the people around, Shkolu glima nigiduba. Somebody grab a cloak and throw it over where the mechitza used to be. Not exactly clear why he did this. The Gemara is going to ask, what was he trying to do? We don't really know. It sounds like at this point, he's trying to kind of rebuild the mechitza, which is a little bit strange. How can you really build a mechitza on Shabbat? And right, what we saw a whole thing about it. Is it like building an ohel arai, a temporary tent? Anyway, and the other thing you see is he tells them, go carry a cloak, which means he doesn't think there's any issue of carrying because he tells them to take a cloak. So this matches Shmuel because Shmuel says, Kevan shu hutra hutra. Once it was allowed in the beginning of Shabbat, we can continue to carry, which then we'd have to ask, well, why does he want to rebuild this mechitza then? The second thing is, Rav is sitting there, and Rav, we clearly know, doesn't hold that way. So let's see what Rav's reaction is. Ahadrinu Rav la'apeh. He turns his head around, kind of in an act of, I disagree with you, right? But in a kind of respectful way, right? He just turns around. He doesn't start screaming, what are you doing? You can't do that. He just kind of turns away in an act of saying, I don't agree with you. Amar lehu Shmuel. Shmuel says to Rav, now this is also a very interesting line, and there's many different interpretations exactly what this means and why he says this. So Shmuel says to Lehu, now notice he doesn't speak directly to Rav, he speaks to the people around him. Lehu means lahem, okay? Le would be to him, but Lehu means to them. Shmuel says to them, Ikapid Abba, if Rav really doesn't think this is the right thing to do, Shkolu hemene vikatuba. Grab his belt and tie it with his belt. What this means exactly? Most people say he's saying this in a joking manner, like, oh, Rav doesn't agree with me, and sometimes when something happens, the best way to respond is to just joke around and make light of it. And maybe that's what Shmuel was doing because it was a little embarrassing to him that Shmuel turned his face away. So he said, oh, if Rav doesn't agree with me, I'll show him, right? Let's take his belt. Okay, that's why it says hemne. Some people say it specifically, the focus is on take Rav himself before they just took anyone's cloak. We're going to use Rav's belt and show him that it can be done. Some people say that it meant take a belt, specifically a belt. Why? Because a belt we can then tie it on, meaning it's so okay to do that I can even tie it on even more strongly than I was planning to. So anyway, either which way, it's kind of Shmuel's way of saying, why don't you agree with me, Rav? Ula Shmuel. So now that's the end of the story. So the questions, there's a number of questions. The Shmuel, lama liha. Why did he need this mechitza? Why did he want the glima, the cloak, to put over the wall where the wall was? What was the purpose? So, each one is allowed, according to Shmuel, to carry to wherever their mechitza was originally. You don't need to fix the mechitza. And not only that, they don't ask this, but if you really wanted to fix the mechitza, then you wouldn't actually be able to carry the cloak to get to the mechitza if it was a problem, right? If the mechitza wasn't there. So what did they answer? Shmuel avid litzniuta ba'alma. He just did it for privacy purposes, because when you have the people who had their own courtyard with a wall there, and the other people had, right, and the wall provides privacy for the courtyard. So now their privacy is breached. It had nothing to do with halacha. It was just so that they'd continue to have their own privacy. Now we're going to question Rav. The Rav isfir le asir lemale. Why did Rav say this is forbidden? If you really, right, imagine you're sitting in that situation, you think you know better, right? You say, hey, this is usher. Why didn't he say so? Why did he just turn his head away? So they say, atre de Shmuel hava. He was in the place where Shmuel was. It was Shmuel's city, and it was not appropriate to start criticizing Shmuel, right? Again, this is the same idea, as he didn't want to take over the Rosh Yeshiva position. This is the kind of respect, right? We've learned you can't be moreh halacha b'fnei rabo. This is a little bit different, right? That's where you have a senior rabbi and you're not allowed to teach halacha in his presence. Rav was actually a little more senior than Shmuel. They were the same generation, but Rav was a little more senior than him. And yet he had this respect for Shmuel not to do anything in his city against what Shmuel said. So now the obvious question, but he did indicate that he didn't agree with him. As if he really wanted to respect Shmuel, he would have just done nothing. Here he did turn away, which was a clear act of, I disagree with you. So what's the answer? Rav was walking a fine line here. On the one hand, he didn't want to disrespect Shmuel. On the other hand, he wanted people to know what his opinion was. He didn't want people to think that he had changed his mind and that he agreed with Shmuel on this issue. And therefore, he turned away to show, I disagree with what happened. So from here, you see, this is again, the Gemara trying to give you this whole lowdown to explain to you that you have to be very cautious when you disagree with someone, how to do it in a way that's respectful, especially if you come into their city and they're the ones in charge there, or their yeshiva or their school, and you start saying, I disagree with you. You have to be very careful how you do it. You have to balance between, on the one hand, wanting to get your opinion across and being honest and truthful. On the other hand, not being disrespectful. And we all know that this is not always the easiest thing to manage. Okay, new Mishnah. That's our, idea for the day. Okay, now we're back to technical Eruvin issues. We're going to have today all different kinds of cases of pirtzot, of things that happen, okay, where the wall breaks. So the next Mishnah talks about chatzer shenifritza l'reshut harabim. Okay, for this we'll pull up the picture. We have a courtyard that all of a sudden gets breached. One second, what's up this problem? Okay, we have a courtyard that's breached into Reshut Harabim. Sorry, I'm getting up the picture in a second. Okay, let's take our courtyard. We have a courtyard. Normally, a courtyard is considered a private domain because, right, that's the whole idea of a courtyard. It's more private space. But now there was a wall, and the Chatzer always has walls on all four sides. Let's review some basic laws. If there's an opening up to 10 cubits, including an opening of 10 cubits, we say that's an opening, not a breach. Remember the difference between opening and a breach? An opening just means, oh, now I have an opening, I can walk out through here, but it doesn't change the status of your courtyard. Once you have a breach, that turns your courtyard into a more public space. And generally, we're going to say that's going to turn your courtyard into what we call a karmelit, right? Because it's still a private space of a courtyard because there's people and it belongs to people. On the other hand, it's more public because people can come in because it's breached, but we usually call it a karmelit. But we're going to see something interesting in this Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer has a unique opinion. Okay, in this case, the chatzir leads out to the street. And the whole wall, okay, we'll see exactly, there's a debate among the Mepharshim exactly how much of, maybe it's even more than one wall, but we'll leave it at this picture where it's just a breach, a big breach in that fourth wall that leads to the public domain. If you take items from the street into the courtyard, what does chayav mean? This goes back to everything we learned in Masechet Shabbat. When we say chayav, we mean chayav chatat. You have to bring a korban chatat if you did this unwittingly, which means it's forbidden by Torah law. Now, what would be forbidden by Torah law? Before a minute ago, I said this would be like a karmelit. According to Rabbi Eliezer, we treat this like reshut harabim. It's like a public domain because look at it. It's fully open to the public. That means this is like a public domain. Now, we're going to question this and when we get to the Gemara, because it doesn't make so much sense that we would call this a public domain. It's still owned by the people in the courtyard. It's not exactly a public domain. And the people on the street might get in, but they're going to go all the way to the other side of the courtyard. It's very strange, Rabbi Eliezer opinion. We're going to have a lot of issues. And therefore, today in general, we're going to have Mishnayot that the rabbis couldn't understand. And because it's based on other things they know, and because of that, they reread the Mishnah into understanding it in a way that makes sense to them. So according to him, it's considered Reshut HaRabim. Chachamim omrim, mitocha l'Reshut HaRabim, omer Reshut HaRabim l'tocha. If you want to go now, till now we were talking about, sorry, I think I said it wrong. I got confused for a minute. What Rabbi Eliezer was talking about was Chatzir she'nifratza l'Reshut HaRabim hamachnis mitocha l'Reshut HaYachid. Is because we call this a Reshut HaRabim, the courtyard. If you take items, I think I didn't say this way. I think I said it from the public. What I meant was from the house to the courtyard or from the courtyard to the house. Since the courtyard is now public domain, anything from the house to the courtyard is private domain to public domain, and it's forbidden by Torah law. The Chachamim now don't address his exact situation. They say it a little differently. They say, Mitocha l'Reshut HaRabim, or Reshut HaRabim l'tocha patur, mipnei she'ikeh karmelit. The rabbis say, this whole space is not a Reshut HaRabim. It's a karmelit, this chatzir. Yes, it's true, it's open to Reshut HaYachid, to Reshut HaRabim, to the public. That turns it into what we call a karmelit. Karmelit, now, if you take from the public domain to the courtyard, it's only going to be forbidden by rabbinic law. And likewise, he doesn't say this, but it's obvious. From your house to the courtyard, which is the case that Rabbi Eliezer was talking about, is also going to be forbidden by the rabbinic law, because you're going to, right? It's not going to be forbidden by Torah law because the chatzir is a karmelit and not considered a public domain. Okay, so that's where we're at right now. So we have Rabbi Eliezer. It's really very simply saying, do we call this courtyard a public domain or do we call it a karmelit? Once it's a karmelit, it's only d'Rabbanan, any kind of transferring. If we call it public, then from your house to there, to the chatzir, is going to be forbidden by Torah law. So the Gemara starts off and asks, Rabbi Eliezer, mishum denifratza l'Reshut HaRabim, havila Reshut HaRabim? Just because it's open to the public doesn't take this courtyard, which is owned by individuals. How can it possibly turn it from a private domain to a public domain? That doesn't make sense. So they say, in fact, he does hold this way, and we're going to see somewhere else where he holds something similar. Rabbi Eliezer l'tameh, he goes according to his opinion, Ditanya. It says in the following Braita, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mishum Rabbi Eliezer, Rabim shebereru derech la'atzman, ma shebereru bereru. Let's say I have a field, and on one side is public, and on the other side is public, and people want to get through, and instead of going on some path all the way on the end, they go through my field. They can turn that part of my field into a public domain. So what do they say? Here you see. Rabbi Eliezer holds that you can take something that's privately owned and turn it into a publicly owned space. Basically, if lots of people walk through my field at a particular place, they can turn it into Reshut HaRabim. So that's exactly our case. So now they say, wait a minute, that's not exactly true. What I just said isn't really right. Ini, is that really so? V'hamar Rav Gidal Amarav, v'hu she'avda lahen derech b'oto sadeh. People can't just go through my field. and turn it into their own path. The only time they can do it is if I had a path that was in my field that people walk through. It was already, let's say I built my property around a road and I left the road open for people to walk through. And then you can imagine in those days, there was this path and the rains came and washed away the path and no one could tell anymore where the path was. So they can then come in and decide, in other words, again, whether they do this intentionally or they're just going to end up that there's going to be some new path drawn through my property that people are going to walk through, then it's okay. But you can't just take my property and turn it into public space. You can only do it if there was a space, it got somehow erased, wiped out, not noticed anymore. People can then choose a different one. So they're kind of swapping one for the other. That's allowed. That's not the case in our Mishnah. The case in our Mishnah was it was fully owned by the courtyard people, and now all of a sudden people from the public are coming. So you can't say that that explains Rabbi Eliezer. So now they suggest, well, since Rabbi Eliezer says it in that case, let's try to come up with our case that's similar to that case. Which would mean what? What could possibly be the case? So let's look back at our picture. Okay, we're in picture 339. Maybe what would be the case where the people say we had a space and now we don't know where it is? Well, look at the border between the courtyard and the public. In this picture, it's incredibly clear. You see the breaches of the walls and you see the line and you see this is green and this is black, and that's because it's a photo, or a picture. But imagine the walls broke somewhere. We don't know, right? Let's say there isn't a little bit left here on the sides of that fourth wall. There's no remnants of the fourth wall, and maybe the other wall also falls down somewhat. And we know, right, the two walls adjacent to it. We don't know anymore where the border was. So they claim, now it's not exactly that they had a space that was taken away and but they claim that the space was taken away from them. They say, and now we're talking about the part that they're arguing about, Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, is not about the whole courtyard. It's about that space where the mechitza was, that it's unclear where the border is. The people in the public domain use it and say, hey, this was ours. Before there was a wall, the wall was further in. And the people in the courtyard say, no, the wall was further out. Okay. And that's the space where, if it's in that space where they're having a debate about, that's what we're going to call it Reshut HaRabim. Because now, why can it be Reshut? In other words, what we basically say is the Reshut HaRabim have the upper hand. And they can say, we know that this is the case, right? We trust them. Once Rabim are walking through, that basically cancels out the Chatzir's rights to that space. So, but if you notice, this started with the words v'chitema. Now, v'chitema is usually going to be, or always going to be rejected. V'chitema, if you want to say that our case is like that, v'hama Rabbi Chanina, when he talked about the Mishnah, our Mishnah, he said, ad makom mechitza. He said, we're talking about until the place of the mechitza, which means he's not talking about the space where the mechitza was. He's talking about the space inside the courtyard until we get to where the mechitza was. So you can't say that's the machloket. But now we're going to go back and say, oh, no, actually you can. Ema al makom mechitza machloket. Say, no, the debate between them is not until the place of the mechitza, meaning the courtyard, until you get to where the wall was. No, it's about the place of the mechitza, right? To change ad to al is very easy. It's just one letter. We're basically going to say the machloket between them was about the mechitza, okay? About the space of where the mechitza was. And then we basically change the meaning of the Mishnah. That when Rabbi Eliezer says that this is, right? We thought he meant the entire space. If you carry from the house to anywhere in the courtyard, that's forbidden by Torah law because you're going into a Reshut HaRabim. We're now changing the meaning and saying, no, he really only means if you carry from your house or the courtyard, for all intents and purposes, to that line between the two, right, to where the mechitza used to be, that people in the public are claiming it's public space. That's when you're going to be obligated midoraita, and that's when the rabbis say, no, it's only rabbinic. We don't give the upper hand to the rabbim. Since there's a debate about it, we're going to say it's only forbidden midorabanan. Another explanation, which is similar to this, is that we're talking about this, but really the machloket between them is about what we call tzidei Reshut HaRabim. Okay, we've talked about tzidei Reshut HaRabim. I'll refresh your memory because it's been a long time. If you go to the Cardo, okay, the Cardo in the old city, so you have, the Cardo is this big long strip, right, with stores on the sides. And what you have, and this is in the words of the Gemara, chipufim, if you know there's those pillars on the side, right? So you have this open street with pillars on the sides. Now the area where the pillars are, behind the pillars were stores, but there's a space in between that where the pillars are. So that space is called tzidei Reshut Rabim. It's not where tons of people walk through, because once there's a pillar there, it's harder to get through there. But it is a space where sometimes if the shuk was really full, it would overflow into, people would go into that space. So if you needed it, you would use it. So it's kind of for use of the public, but not exactly, because it's not part of the main drag. So what they're saying is their machloket is really about tzidei Reshut Rabim, right? It's this space that's in between public and private. It's not exactly public and not exactly private. And then if the machloket's about that, then again, look back to our picture. It's just like, and this is similar to the previous one, it's just adding that really the machloket is about something bigger, about tzidei Reshut Rabim, which would then apply here also. This space where the wall used to be now becomes this in-between space. It's like an overflow for the Reshut Rabim, but it also is sort of private because it's not exactly on the public road, and that's their machloket. To Rabbi Eliezer savar tzidei Reshut Rabim ki Reshut Rabim damu. Rabbi Eliezer says the sides of the Reshut Rabim are considered like Reshut Rabim because people use them, even though they only use them when they need to overflow, but it's commonly used space and it's public. The Rabbanan savre, and likewise he'll say by us, that border line there between the two, if people from Reshut Rabim use it, it's going to become public space. And then again, if you carry from there to your house or from your house to there, you'll be obligated by Torah law. The Rabbanan savre tzidei Reshut Rabim lav ki Reshut Rabim damu. They say, no, it's not ki Reshut Rabim. Okay? So now we're going to say, well, if really the machloket is about tzidei Reshut Rabim, then what would you have expected? The Mishnah to talk about tzidei Reshut Rabim, right? If that's the main issue, and this is just an outgrowth of that, liflog with tzidei Reshut Rabim ba'alma, then they should have brought the machloket in with the topic of tzidei Reshut Rabim, and that's not what they did. So now they say no. Well, the reason why they gave this case is if lagu b'tzidei Reshut Rabim, if they had said the argument was all about tzidei Reshut Rabim ba'alma, hava amrina, we might have thought ki pligi Rabbanat. Now, there's one big difference between tzidei Reshut Rabim and our case. What is that? You might have thought ki pligi Rabbanan alei de Rabbi Eliezer hanimile echad ika chipufe, aval hechad alecha chipufe ema module. You might have thought tzidei Reshut Rabim has those pillars there because they have the pillars. Right? What do I think about? I think about when you have a place where they don't want cars to go. We talked about this the other day, right? That they have these I don't know what they're called, poles, right? It's short poles on the ground. We're in Israel by bus stops sometimes, so that nobody does any, run. They don't do any drive. I can't even think of the word, but right when a car rammings. So right, which has happened to soldiers at bus stops. So they put in stakes or some sort of barrier there. So that's the idea here, that in tzidei Reshut Rabim, you have those, I see people are sending me all different words for them. Thank you. Or ballards. You have those on the ground. Therefore, it's a clearly demarcated area. So that's where the Chachamim will say that we're going to call a Carmelit, because there's something that demarcates the difference between this and Reshut Rabim. But in our case, the wall fell down. You now have this open space. There's no clear border. So maybe in that case, you would have thought, right? I'm going to read it again. Ki pligi Rabbanan alei Rabbi Eliezer. When the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, maybe if you said it was tzidei Reshut Rabim, you would have thought hanimile hechad ika chipufe. Only when you have those things in the ground. Aval hechad alecha chipufe. But when there aren't chipufe, ema module. Maybe they would hold like Rabbi Eliezer, that in our case, we're going to actually call it Reshut Rabim because there's no line that separates Reshut Rabim from the courtyard. Kamash malan. That's why they need to teach you specifically in our case. Chachamim also disagree and still think it's considered part of the courtyard. But now we have another problem. Look at Rabbi Eliezer's wording. What does he say? This is a very nice explanation of the Mishnah. It works in logically with what we know to be another, and fits in, but it doesn't fit in with the words of the Mishnah. Look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Chatzer shenifritza Reshut Rabim, hamachnis mitocha, from within it to Reshut Yachid, or Reshut Yachid to the court, right? Litocha, to inside. It doesn't say to the border. It says to inside. That sounds like the whole courtyard. That's why we understood it that way to begin with. So v'hami tocha ka'amar. So the Gemara says, no, it just used that wording there because it wanted to use that wording later. Okay, which is what? Because the rabbis used the word mitocha, therefore Rabbi Eliezer used the word mitocha, but he really meant the border. So now they want to know for Rabbanan. Now, why did Rabbanan use the words mitocha? Because Amar Rabbi Eliezer tzidei reshut harabim. That's Rabbi Eliezer was really talking about a case like tzidei reshut harabim, the sides. Umahadre le'inu, and the rabbi's reaction to Rabbi Eliezer was to say like this. Mitocha, meaning they responded to Rabbi Eliezer. He was talking only at the border. They started saying about the inside. And what did they really say? And now they're going to say there was a back conversation happening that we didn't know about, that now we're going to hear about. This is really what they were saying. Milok, and this is why they use the lashon of mitocha, the inside of the courtyard. Mi lo kamodi lan, don't you agree with me, Rabbi Eliezer? Hecha detiltel mitocha lereshut harabim u'mireshut harabim letocha depatur. Don't you agree with me that if you take from public to the chatzer and the chatzer to the public, wouldn't you agree with me to the inside of the courtyard that you be exempt? In other words, don't you agree with me that the inner part of the courtyard is a carmelit, which actually, according to the way we explained it now, Rabbi Eliezer would agree about the inside. And therefore, they want to then take it one step farther. In other words, if you agree with me about that, this is also, we learned about ways of arguing. When you want to argue with someone, you say, look, don't you agree with me about this? And if you agree with me about this, agree with me about the next step. So if you agree with me that the inside of the courtyard is a problem, then sideinami lo shna, then you should agree with me also that the border should be no different. That we're not going to all of a sudden say this is d'oraita when there's actually no boundary there at all. For Rabbi Eliezer, hatam lo kadar se larabim, hacha kadar se larabim. And Rabbi Eliezer distinguishes. He says, no, I disagree. There's a big difference between the courtyard and the border between the courtyard and reshut harabim. What's the big difference? The big difference is the courtyard itself, you don't have a lot of people roaming about there because it's the courtyard space for those houses. But the part where it's unclear where the border is, already lots of people are walking through here. Because of that, I'm going to call it reshut harabim. And that's the machloket between them. And that's how we explain the language of tocha. Tocha is just the rabbi's way of saying, don't you agree with me, tocha, and therefore you'd agree with me also about the border? And again, make it very clear, this is not the pshat reading of the Mishnah. This is how the rabbis had to read the Mishnah because it didn't make sense to them. We're going to have the same thing coming up with the next Mishnah. The same problem of the rabbis didn't understand the pshat of the Mishnah and they have to change it. So now we're getting to the next Mishnah. We have a chatzer that was breached to reshut harabim like ours, except what's the difference now? Mishtei ruchoteha. Two sides are breached. Or a house that two walls fell down. You put up a korah or a lechi to fix the mavoi, and they fell down. Mutarim ba'oto Shabbat v'asurim la'atid lavo tivrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, right, what we saw before. Kevan shu'utra hu'utra. Okay, there we saw was a machloket a moraim of Rabbi Shmuel. Here we see it's a machloket tanim. Rabbi Yehuda says, since you started Shabbat, everything was fine. The fact that the status changed, it doesn't affect anything for now, but it does affect things for the future. Okay, meaning if you don't fix this breach, next week you're not allowed to carry here. Comes Rabbi Yossi, he disagrees. Rabbi Yossi omer umutarim la'oto Shabbat, mutarim la'atid lavo, ve'im asurim la'atid lavo, asurim la'oto Shabbat. You can't have it both ways. Either it's a breach. If it's a breach, then it's a problem right now. Or it's not a breach, in which case it won't be forbidden next week. What he's basically saying in simpler language is, whatever the status is now is what affects us. We don't care that Shabbos started and it was fine. No, now you have a breach and it's a problem. Okay. The fact is they both agree, and this is what we're going to try to deal with. We're not dealing with their whole machloket about kevan shu'utra. We already discussed that. Now we want to deal with the fact that they both agree that there's some sort of breach here, because even Rabbi Yehuda, who doesn't think it's a breach for this Shabbat, thinks it's a breach for next Shabbat. So the question is, what kind of a breach are we discussing? B'mai askinan. Now we're going to get back to what I started with today, about up to 10 or including 10 cubit opening is what we call an opening, not a breach. It doesn't mess up your wall. You have an opening of 10, we can still walk through there, and we don't say, right, you can still say, this is my private courtyard, it just has an opening. So if it's 10 or less, It shouldn't make a difference if you have an opening on one wall or you have an opening on two walls. We could call that, okay, there's an opening to the chutzner on that wall. There's an opening to a chutzner on that wall. This shouldn't forbid anything. And yet everyone agrees it's forbidden. So it can't be up to and including 10 cubits because that's just an opening. Right? The whole issue is going to be why all of a sudden are we saying two walls and not one? What does two walls make a difference to one? If it's that you call it an opening, well, it's an opening in two walls, and that's fine. You can have a chutzner with an opening here, an opening there. That doesn't ruin your courtyard, your privacy of your courtyard. So therefore, they say, Ela b'yeter me'asel. Well, if it's more than 10, then we have another problem, the other direction. Well, then it should be a problem if one wall is breached, your chutzner is already messed up. So this is saying two walls. So that doesn't make any sense either. So now we're stuck. It can't be 10 or less. It can't be more than 10. Either which way, our Mishnah doesn't make sense. As again, why did our Mishnah say two walls and not one? So Amarav, La'olam be'esel, it is 10 cubits, but Kigon shenifritza b'keren zavit. We're going to see a picture. Again, this is stuff we saw in the very beginning of the Masechet. You might not remember, but it's that there was a breach in the corner. Okay, now what's different about a breach in the corner? Now it's two walls because it's a corner, so it's breached there and it's breached there. Altogether, it's a 10 cubit or less opening. Normally, we call this a petach. In this case, we're going to call it a breach. Why are we going to call it a breach? People don't generally use entrances and exits that are in corners. It's very inconvenient. Normally, you'd have an opening on the side of the wall and in the middle, not in the corner. So an opening in the corner is not the way you generally do an opening. Therefore, even though generally 10 is considered an opening, in this case, since it's in the corner, that's not considered an opening. It's considered a breach. And that's how we resolve. Our Mishnah must be talking about in the corner. That's the courtyard. Okay, now we're going to move on to the bayit case, the house. So now the Gemara says, again, same question. What's the difference, one wall or two? Let's say one wall of your house is breached. Why is that not a problem? So, probably the difference is, it wouldn't be a problem. Why? Because what do we say? The ceiling, remember, a house has a ceiling, the roof. So we assume the roof drops down an imaginary mechitza, right? You have a square house or a rectangular shaped house. The wall, the roof drops down, right? So if you have one wall missing, we say pitikra yoreh b'sotem. Well, in that case, mishte ruchot nami lema, pitikra yoreh b'sotem. Pitikra yoreh b'sotem works a number of walls. It doesn't only work on one wall. So if that's the case, if it's breached on two walls and you can say pitikra yoreh b'sotem, shouldn't be a problem for two either. In other words, again, we go back to the question, why two and not one? Well, one probably is okay because pitikra, well, then that should apply also to two. So we're stuck again. We're going to have two answers, one of Rav, one of Shmuel. Amrei debei Rav, from the house of Rav, they say Mishmei de Rav, in the name of Rav. Kigon shenifratz bekeren zavit. Again, he's going to say the same thing, but a little bit different here. It's nifratz bekeren zavit bekiruyo ba'alachson. Okay, there's two ways to understand kiruyo ba'alachson. In this picture, you only have one, but if you have another Gemara, some of the other Gemaras show both pictures. This is Rashi's explanation. It means, we're in picture 341. The house is breached in the corner, just like the other one, and the roof is angled. Now, what does it mean if the roof is angled? It means, now you have to, according to Rashi, there's a few questions here, but if the roof is angled, we've already learned, we call this Bei Arzila. Okay, it's like an Arzila. That was what they called I can't think of the word, but a sloped roof. If the roof is sloped and not flat, then you can't say pitikra. Pitikra only works for a flat roof, so you can't say pitikra here. There's a bit of a weakness here, which is you could have just said flat roof. You didn't have to say it was breached in the corner. Why specifically in the corner? Tosfot says it's breached in the corner, and kiriyova alachson means, I'm going to show you the next picture, even though it's not exactly the next picture, but I can explain it better using this picture. If you look at picture 342, you see that there's a flat roof and there's a breach in the corner. Not only is there a breach in the wall in the corner, there's also a breach in the ceiling in the corner, and it's breached in an alachson, not the way this picture shows. It's breached on an angle, meaning it's like you cut out a triangle of the roof in the corner. If you cut out a triangle of the roof in the corner, try to do pitikra, you need a pet, you need the corner. So Tosfot says that's the problem here. Tosfot's proof that it's not a sloped roof is because he says, last time we talked about a sloped roof, it's called the Bei Arzila. It would have said Bei Arzila if that's what they meant. So either which way, Rav explains, whether you go with Tosfot or Rashi, he says it's nifratz b'keren zavid and kiruyoba alachson, and that's why. So it's up, it's let's say a 10 breach or less, but it's in the corner. You can't use pitikra here, and that's why again, it's 2 walls. That's why we have it in the corner. It's 2 walls that are in the corner breach, and you can't say pitikra. Deleka lememar pitikra yorev sotem. Shmuel Amar. Now Shmuel goes back to even the courtyard case. Okay, Shmuel says afilu biyeter me'eser, whether it's the house or the courtyard, even if it's more than 10. So then they say, well, then if it's more than 10, we're back to our original question. Ihachi meruach hachat nami, right? So then even one side of let's say go back to the courtyard, one side of a courtyard being breached would be a problem. So mishum bayit, they say, it's because really you didn't need to say 2 in the courtyard. This is just like you didn't need to say mitocha and Rabbi Eliezer. It's just the rabbi said it, so they said it. Really, it was for the house case that we talked about 2, not for the courtyard. The courtyard, even at 1, it would be the situation, but it's for the house. So then they say, okay, well, that still doesn't help us. By gufe tikshe. So still the house, why 2 walls? Again, we still say the same question we started with Rav. Because right now we're assuming 2 walls of the house. We're not up to this, right, the corner yet. Again, on one side, we'd say pitikra. That's the first question on Shmuel. Doesn't help us that we say it's a house. House, 1 wall, 2 walls should be the same. Either you say pitikra or you don't say pitikra. And all the more so, if you want to say pitikra yorev sotem, and that's why 1 wall is not a problem. But mi ile l'shmuel pitikra yorev sotem. Don't you remember we learned that Shmuel doesn't hold pitikra yorev sotem? Vaha itmal, it was said, achsadra bebika. Remember, you have a portico, a covered space. The best way to imagine this is a chuppah, right? 4 poles with a roof on top. Rav Amar mutar l'taltel b'kula. Rav says this whole thing is viewed as if it has walls because we drop down all the walls. Ushmuel Amar ein metaltelim ba b'dalet amot. Shmuel says you can't say pitikra, so we're back to square one. How could Shmuel? Why would there be a difference, 2 or 1? Even 1 should be a problem according to Shmuel because he doesn't hold pitikra. But if you remember, we already answered this before. Halo kashya, we learned this a few days ago. That shouldn't pose a problem. The second question, and then we'll go back to the first one. Ki leitle be'arba aval b'shalosh itle. He says you can't use pitikra for 4 walls, like the achsadra bebika, where there's 0 walls and you want to make all 4 drop down. But once you have 1 wall, you can have 3 imaginary walls drop down, according to Shmuel. And our case would be all you need is 1 wall to drop down, right? And therefore, in 1 wall, for sure, Shmuel says you can drop down 1 wall, even in 2 walls. So we're back to square one, which is why 2 and not 1? If 1 works, pitikra according to Shmuel, 2 should also work. So mikomakom kasha, we're still left with the difficulty. So now they say like this. Just like Rav gave this explanation, again, Rav's explanation, I'll bring up the picture again, was that we're talking about a breach in the corner and it was angled somehow. We don't know exactly, but it was angled. Let's say the roof was angled or the cut was angled on the roof. Hachanami, I'll give you something like that, but a little bit different. And then I'll explain to you why when it's 2 walls, it's going to be a problem. Okay, arba, some people say it's arba'ah. It actually sounds like it means 1 in this. It means 2 different things, which we're going to explain right now. It's without the picture, it's a little hard to explain. So I hope you can see the pictures, picture 342. But it's basically where instead of the way Rav said, and the way Tosfot explained Rav, that we cut off like a triangle of the roof, we cut it off like in a zigzag, and you end up in that zigzag with 4 walls. Okay, you end up with 4 little walls. It goes out, to the right, out, and to the right again. And then you end up, that's how your zigzag is cut out from your roof. So it's a flat roof with things cut out that way. Now, what's the problem? According to this, Shmuel needs pitikra to be on 4 walls because you basically need 4 walls to drop down. Here they number them very well. 1, right? Each time you go out, in, you end up with 4 different walls that need to drop down. And Shmuel says you can't drop 4 walls. Also, some people say ba'arba'ah, it's with 4 tfachim. It means that when you go out from each wall where it starts to be cut off, each one of those spaces is more than 4 tfachim, because if it's less than 4 tfachim, then it's not significantly enough away that if you just drop 2 walls by 2 and 3 in the middle, you could kind of say that those are attached to the bigger wall, and that would be okay. So some people say it would have to be with a 4 tfachim of different distance. But anyway, without getting into all the details, the idea is that you can't do pitikra in this case, and it's a case where it's on two walls because it's in the corner. So he basically takes Rav's answer, but adapts it to his own. So again, we're taking this Mishnah and saying that when we said breached on two walls, it doesn't really mean two walls. In a regular case, it means two walls on the corner, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. If it's really a breach, it should be even a problem on one wall. And if it's not a breach, it shouldn't even be a problem on two walls. So we basically have to say it's this breach in the corner, and that resolves all our issues. So now they want to know why each one didn't hold like the other. Ushmuel lo amar kerav, because alachson lo katane, it didn't say anywhere about an alachson, about an angle, so because it didn't say, it must not be the case. And Rav lo amar keshmuel, because im ken havaleach sadra. If Rav didn't hold like Shmuel, because he thinks, remember, Rav holds 4 walls dropping down is no problem for him. He says this is just like any achsadra. And Rav l'tameh da'amar sadra mutar l'taltel b'kula. He thinks you can drop down 4 walls when there's no walls at all. So he would have no problem to drop down the 4 walls the way Shmuel describes it. And now we're going to just review that machloket that we already saw. To itmar achsadra bebika. Again, you have this portico in the middle of a valley. Remember, we talked about last time, the reason they said valley was because valley, there's no walls nearby. If you're already in an inhabited space, likely the portico is going to be right up against a wall somewhere, and then even Shmuel will agree with Rav. But if it's in a big wide open space and there's no walls, Rav amar mutar l'taltel b'kula, u'Shmuel amar ein metaltelim ba'ela ba'arba amot. Rav says you can carry in the whole space. Shmuel says only 4 cubits because he views this as Carmelite. Rav amar mutar l'taltel b'kula because amrinam pitikra yoreh v'sotain. We can view those 4 walls as dropping down. And Shmuel amar ein metaltelim ba'arba amot lo amrinam pitikra yoreh v'sotain. We don't say that. Now we're going to have one last debate about their debate. Okay, 2 views here. Be'eser kule amalu pligi. They're now going to say that up to 10, up to and including 10 cubits, nobody disagrees. Now here we're talking about the achsadra bebika. This machloka, we're now a little bit on a tangent. If you have an achsadra bebika that's less, that the space between the poles is 10 or less, so even Shmuel's going to agree that then you can view all 4 walls as dropping down. Why? Because Rashi says, if you look at 4 lines from the bottom of Rashi, they're just openings. Even without pitikra, you don't even need pitikra. They're openings. They're not pirtzot. Now Tosafot says that doesn't really make much sense because remember we learned another thing. If it parutz merubah la'omed, it's mostly breached, right? It's mostly open. When we say up to 10, that's when you have more standing than not standing. Here, all you have is a pole, and how could you say it? But presumably what it means is, since it's the size of a petach, and you have this principle of pitikra, we can use pitikra works in that case because the opening is not big enough that it's such a problem, so we allow imaginary walls to drop. But their machloket is beyeter me'esel. More than 10, Shmuel is going to say only if you have 1 wall can you have other walls drop down. And Rav is going to say, no, you can even at bigger than 10, right? Even if it's bigger than 10 amot, you can still have imaginary walls drop down. The second reading is Ikeda Amre beyeter kule amalu pligi. Nobody disagrees at more than 10, meaning even Rav thinks that if let's say your chuppah structure is bigger than 10 cubits, even Rav's going to say there's no way we can make mechitza come down there without any sort of wall. But kipligi be'eser, their machloket is when it's 10. When it's only 10, Rav will say we can imagine those walls going down, and Shmuel is going to say no, even though it's only a petach, we still don't, and maybe because of the reason that it's parutz merubah la'omed, it's mostly open, therefore we can't allow pitikra to work. So there's a debate about which case they exactly argue about how big this achsadra is. Okay, we'll stop here for today. Have a good day. So again, just to review this idea about, we took these Mishnayot because they didn't make sense. The rabbis had to reinterpret them, that they were talking about unique circumstances, right? Or different than we actually intended them from the start.